I suspect that at the Mille Miglia, they didn't own a yellow flag, though.
It's Italy. Do they own anything organized? No.
I remember reading that I guess like shortly after they started, he tossed his cookies, didn't he?
Yeah, at like $1.50, turns his head and he loses his goggles. And then he loses his glasses with his goggles. And then he pukes over the side of the car. The race was staggered in starts. And it encompassed everything from like somebody ran it in a 2CV that year. I think the last place car.
I'd love to see that.
Right. Like literally the car named for 2 horsepower. 2CV guy, you just lick the stamp. They're in 5th gear, 7,500 RPM, which is like $1.70 or something. Jenkinson's line was, "We had made an error in our estimation of the severity of the hump." Sounds like the most, like the driest stage directions for porn.
And the track had to have changed from their pre-running. There must have been gravel on the track, or dew in the morning, or some Italian lady threw out her wash water on the sidewalk and it ran on the track. Mille Miglia was pretty unpredictable.
Somebody's got to say it. Who's going to say it? I already said it once. I can't say it again. Who's going to say it?
Right.
Oh, right. It's not the.
It's not the car.
Thank you. There. And our topic is the 1955 running of the Mille Miglia. It's one of the most famous races in history, not because of what it was, although it was something pretty crazy, not because of when it happened, although it happened in a crazy time, but because of who won it and how he won it and what happened when he won it. Dude, Ross is going to take a nap and Jeff is going to lie to me.
I'm going to have a sip of coffee.
Okay. All right. So 3, 2, 1. All right. So start before the war. It's 1930s. It's Germany. Hitler. Everybody knows Hitler, right? Hitler was a terrible prick. He wants to prove to the world Nazi power is best for a bunch of reasons. He kicks off a dozen things that lead to World War II, but he also wants to spend Nazi money to dominate the planet in other areas, right? So he throws crazy money at Auto Union and Mercedes. They dominate Grand Prix racing the last years before the war. It's some of the most insane and expensive engineering ever seen. Boom. All right. Next scene. The war happens. The war ends. After the war, because Germany was Germany and everything that happened in Germany was everything that happened in Germany, Mercedes-Benz is banned from international competition by the FIA. The ban is lifted in 1950. Mercedes is a conservative company, so they don't rush things. They buy back, because it was gone, because it had been expatriated, they buy back their most advanced pre-war racing car and try and reassemble the lessons from it. And they start building a team because they're Germans and they're organized. And Germans, as you know, we learned in the war, when they put their mind to something, well, things happen. So they start thinking and learning. And in December of 1951, the rules are announced for the next change in Formula One. The next change in Formula One is coming in 1954. There's a displacement change. There's a minimum weight change. The series is figuring out what it is. Because remember, Grand Prix racing, kind of old, been around for decades. Formula One fairly new at the time. Mercedes in 1952 says, all right, screw it. We're going balls to the wall. They decide to make this bonkers all-out assault on the 1954 F1 championship. They build a car. That car wins the title in 1954 in the hands of one of the greatest drivers who ever lived. That driver is not who we're talking about today. At the time, Mercedes looked at this driver, that Argentinian guy who we're not going to name, even though I really want to, because Sam can't shut up. We're going to go in a different direction there. That Argentinian guy was the best in the world, save one dude. The other dude was an Englishman. His name was Stirling Moss. He was a national hero in England. He was a protege. He started young. He was fast in everything. In late 1954, he tests Mercedes-Benz's F1 car at Hockenheim after the end of the season, breaks the lap record. Mercedes-Benz is like, oh, hell yes, we want you. Oh, hell yes, we're going to go forward. Then they look around and decide, screw it, we're going big. Not just the F1 championship, we're going the International Sports Car Championship. Now that means a lot of things it does not mean today. At the time, chiefly, that meant open road endurance racing, meaning public roads, traffic shut off, get from A to B as fast as you can. Oh, and everybody else is going to be trying to do it too, which means, in this case, a race called the Mille Miglia in Italy. Mille is Italian for 1,000 miles. Miglia is Italian for milia, miles, whatever. And 1,000 miles across Italy. They ran this race from 1927 to 1957. Open roads, flat out, run by amateurs, manufacturer teams, and everyone in between, from Rome to Brescia and Rome and back, through farmland and mountains and villages and cities, and they'd go tearing across fields and mountains and villages, all of it at 120, 130, 150 miles an hour. said to draw more than 5 million spectators. And if you're thinking this sounds dangerous, it was. People died all the time. In 30 years of running the thing, they killed 56 drivers and spectators. The event ended in 1957 because so many people had died. Even for the Italians, a culture acquainted with and they shrug about everything and they're just like, who cares, right? Eat some more pasta. Anyway, so they're doing this all on roads that are barely paved, that are mostly a lane wide, sometimes a lane and a half. Spectators, those 5 million people, are inches away for 1,000 miles. Moss at Mercedes is stuck into a car, a sports car, open cockpit bolide thing that looks kind of like a 300 SL Go wing, but isn't. It has wire wheels. It has 300 horsepower. It has a straight 8. It is rear-wheel drive on bias ply tires. The engine is basically the F1 engine, bored and stroked. It has no roof. And he has a navigator. And his navigator is a journalist who he asked the Christmas before, hey, do you want to come do this? I like you and respect you. And this journalist, his name was Dennis. Dennis was one of the raddest guys in history. His calling card as a journalist was to basically sit there and look at racing drivers and go, you're terrible at this and you're good at this. And I have no emotion and I'm not involved. Dennis is in the right seat. He has no emotion as Moss does more than 170 miles an hour for long periods of time up and down Italy. Now, keep in mind, this is without anything remotely like aerodynamic grip, without anything like tires, without anything like brakes. The car had inboard drum brakes. Drums. They're rip-assing across Italy, coming into cities at 130 miles an hour, doing a buck 70, outrunning small planes. They run the race, that 1,000 miles, in 10 hours, 7 minutes, and 48 seconds. It's an average speed of 98 miles an hour. It was faster than anyone had gone over the Mille route in 30 years of trying, and it was faster than anyone would ever go again, including Moss, even though he tried, because, again, they ended the race 2 years later because people kept dying. It's one of the greatest races in history, one of the greatest wins in history, but one of the greatest drivers in history. And what gets me, you'll forgive me, I'm going to do it. What I really love about this is that above all, at the bottom, when you really get down to it, it's not about the car.
Yep.
What was that? That was like 30 minutes? Cool, we're done. Okay.
No, yeah. You didn't overload the internet or anything.
No, and the best part is, I want to go and watch this.
Right.
Like, I want to be one of those 5 million spectators standing along the side of I might have stepped back to the second row because I'm a bit of a chicken that way. But yeah, I mean, bizarre, bonkers race.
My first reaction is, so what you're saying, Sam, is, the pain and agony that Ross and I go through for the 24 hours of Daytona and that long race and all that is pretty much insignificant. It pales in comparison.
No, you're very special, Jeff. You're a unique snowflake, and you're very talented.
Right. But you know what the interesting thing is, Jeff and I just finished doing Petit Le Mans, and I was looking at that and go, the Colin won, and their team won at an average speed of 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
1955, they averaged 10 hours at 98 point something miles per hour. Right. Yeah, very, very different circuit, all that kind of stuff. Very, very different in that way. But also, like, they didn't have hybrid power and aerodynamics and all that stuff. It's like, that is just crazy.
It's crazy. I suspect that at the Mille Miglia, they didn't own a yellow flag, though.
It's Italy. Do they own anything organized? No.
Well, and I was reading something about this, and Dennis Jenkinson in his piece where he's talking about, they pass a car that's crashed and there's a little bit of, oh, that's too bad, but one less competitor.
Right.
And
right.
I hate to say this, but I've had that same feeling a little bit in my career where a driver gets hurt and there's a little bit of, well, that's too bad, but maybe there's an opening for me.
Yeah.
And
it's ruthless.
I almost hate to admit that, but I think back in those days, that was even more common, more accepted. Like, you just like, oh, well, sorry, but Mario or whoever just passed away. Good. Well, I got a chance.
And none of this is to denigrate the past against the present or compare them, because I mean it's like art or food or people. Like, that was then, this is now, and the two are related, but they're not the same thing at all. But what gets me is how, in this moment, and Jenkinson talks about it, and Moss talked about it later, Mercedes in so many ways sat down and invented a lot of the practices of modern motorsport in how they prepared and how they looked at it. And Jeff, this is at some point later, not when we're not on the air and taping, and I can ply you with drinks and ask all kinds of dumb questions. I have lots of dumb questions, but about the practices and the thoughts behind planning, because they basically looked at this and they decided, all right, anything that could possibly be done, we'll do it, which meant every pit stop had everything from, extra mechanics and extra tires to trays of tea and cakes, because they didn't know whether the guys would want tea and cakes.
Right.
To the fact that they, like Moss and Jenks, ran that course. They pre-ran it. They started pre-running in February. They ran it 6 times and crashed cars doing it. And they ran it in traffic and they took notes. Jenks had famously, it was one of the first uses of pace notes. He has a 17-foot long piece of paper that he wrote corner speeds out on, basically, the equivalent of right 5 over crest. And
right. Their toilet roll.
Yeah. But the fact that can you imagine if you had to sit down and clean sheet everything about your job and invent it from scratch? How would you even start thinking about that?
So my first reaction when I went back and read some of the links that you sent, Sam, so we could prepare for this, because I was -2 when it happened. my first reaction was, it was okay, cool. Wow. That's amazing. That was 30 seconds. And then I went, all right. So if IMSA decided to do the Mille Miglia next year, and the rules were the same, like there are no rules, bring any car you want and do anything you want. You just got to get from point A to point B, 1,000 miles faster than the next guy. How would I, as the competition director of the, it's not the car team that the 3 of us are going to do, how would I approach that race? It's insane. I mean, so what car do you bring? I would take maybe the last Audi LMP1 car that they did those demonstrations with, where they had adjustable aerodynamics and all that kind of stuff, where they took that to the extreme. Maybe take that car. And then how do you prepare? I started envisioning, Paris-Dakar type operations with mobile pit stop things and helicopters and drones. And I mean, can you imagine what that would entail in today's world, trying to do a race like that? And of course, that doesn't make it what they did any less. It makes it just, they did the same things with the available resources and technology that they had at the time. And that's why they won that race. I'm sure the car was good. No doubt about it. But it's because of the things like the pre-running and the practicing and the understanding of what they were up against better than the next guy.
So Jeff, if they did that, can I drive?
Yeah, for sure.
Which one do you want to be my navigator?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks. Nope. I'm okay.
Not happening.
Is that because you've seen the way I drive?
We're going to have your pace notes just be talked to you in your ear, and we're going to have.
I'm sorry, but I can't be on a lift in the middle of Italy watching the entire thing.
No, we'll have a drone. We'll have a drone that will be able to reach the speed of the car, and so it'll just follow it.
One of the crazy things, so Ross, you and I have talked about this before, but one of the crazy things, Jenks came back. He was a journalist. He wrote for a lot of magazines, but famously the Green Book, British magazine called Motorsport, and he wrote a big, almost hour by hour story on it, just a dissection of everything they did. And one of the things I found really interesting that wasn't in there, because I started reading that again. I've read all these stories a billion times since I was little. I started reading that again, and then I went to Moss's autobiography, and then I went to another book on Moss that he had written with another person. And one of the things he said at one point was that Jenks looked at him, because you mentioned navigating, right? Jenks looked at him, and they were talking later about whether he ever got scared sitting in the right seat. And he was like, oh, no. And it's, Jeff, you mentioned, the notion of how you would go about preparing for it and picking it. And I mean, first thing you wouldn't do is, this was a 300 horse car that weighed 2,800 pounds. And the first thing you would not do is go, well, I'm going to take an F1 motor and dump it into something like a road car and then try and make it last 1,000 miles in 10 hours. They did that, and the rules were different, made different sense. But so at the time, this was massively, massively fast, and it's still very quick. But Jenks had never been in anything like that. And so Moss asked him if he was intimidated or scared, and he said no, because I didn't know what the car could do. And I knew it was so far beyond what I could produce as a driver that it didn't concern me. He said if you had been in a Porsche, Jenks was famously like a 356 guy, a Porsche 356 guy. He said if you had been in a Porsche, I'd have been terrified. Like no way in hell I would have ever gotten in the car. Huh. And the idea that like that, I don't know, I get to thinking, because you and I have talked a lot about how people think about their own performance and then how people think about other people's performance and flow state and how all of it ties together. I just got to thinking about how I would go about making that choice and the choices we make if we know what's going to happen versus if we don't. And even then, whether he was scared or not, he knew he could die at any point. And he still said yes for some reason. I don't know. I mean, where's that leave you with your head? Where do you?
First of all, being naive is a good thing at many times. And I use this as an example often where why are young drivers faster than older drivers?
Yeah.
And so people automatically go, well, older drivers, they don't, the reflexes are not as good, all that kind of stuff. I believe a lot of it is, as we get older, we realize what can happen, and we're more concerned about protecting that. When a driver is 16, they don't have a family, they don't have a job, they don't have any, they don't have anything to live to worry about dying over, right? So I think that's part of it. And I think what you're talking about is Jenks is getting into this car and he's like, it's surprising in some ways because they did pre-run much the course a few times, like you said, but they never did it at full speed, all of it. And I think some of it was, I wonder, I don't know, do you know, like, was Jenks asked to do it the following year? And did he go, hell no, I've done that once, I'm never going to do that again?
They went back and did it, definitely in 57. I don't know if they did in 56. They did in 57, and they got like an hour in before I think the car just completely lost brakes, or the brake pedal broke off, and then other things happened. But they did it again.
You don't need that.
Yeah. Right.
Minor detail.
But the fact that he came back, like, I don't know. You have to know. Well, both of you have to know a bunch of people who've had big moments and stuffed cars, or how do you come back from stuff like that?
Well, the one thing I will say is that having spent a little time around the rally world, the co-driver navigator thing in rally, those people are special. I've had the opportunity to ride in a rally stage in that seat, and never, ever, ever, ever would I do that. But there are some people who are just wired to, that's what they like to do. And, I guess fortunately Jenkinson was one of those guys. So, although I remember reading that's
crazy.
I guess like shortly after they started, he tossed his cookies, didn't he?
Yeah. At like $1.50, turns his head and he loses his goggles. And then he loses his glasses with his goggles, and then he pukes over the side of the car. And Moss, like, I've read other stuff where Moss just looks at him and goes, "Oh, okay, that happened," and then just keeps driving.
It keeps going
because why not, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I couldn't. From what I read, there were no really rules, right? Like you could bring any vehicle that had, I guess not motorcycles, but anything, right? There was no like displacement or rules or any kind of rule, right?
No. So the race was staggered in starts. So, and it encompassed everything from like somebody ran it in a 2CV that year. I think the last place car.
I'd love to see that.
Right. Like literally the car named for 2 horsepower. But somebody ran it in a 2CV. The last place car that year, I remember reading, was a Fiat 600, 600cc that finished like, it was a couple hours behind. But yeah, so no rules. Everything was broken out by displacement. And the race started, Moss and Jenks famously started, the car was number 722. In the Mille, the number was your start time. So they started at 7:22 in the morning, but the night before at like 9 or 10 o'clock, they sent all the slow cars and just like, this 2CV guy, you just lick the stamp.
Wouldn't they have done that in reverse?
Yeah, I remember reading that and going, wow, if I got to drive through the night, that's not fair.
Right. And I'm thinking, you don't, if you're going to start, you start like the fastest seated car first, right? And the slowest guy last.
Yeah.
It would seem to me.
But also Italy. I mean,
well, yeah.
Shrug, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So like you could run anything, and Mercedes basically took it was a version of the car they ran at Le Mans with that motor, which they decided worked for everything. But it's nuts.
That's crazy. I always thought, Russ and I had talked about this before, Formula One, or there should be in the conceptual, you probably couldn't work it out. Nobody could afford it, but there should be a racing class for like that nowadays.
Yeah.
Here's the circuit.
Yeah.
We're going to call it Formula 0.
Yeah.
And bring whatever vehicle you want. It can be powered by anything. It can weigh anything. It can be, maybe you have to have a length and width so people don't make the car as wide as the track so nobody can pass them, but a length, width, and height rule maybe, and that's it. Do whatever you want. And like the Audi LMP1 car with all of its, when they made that revision to it, could be the starting point. And then you just go from there. And anything you can invent, you race.
Yeah, I wish they would do that. Yeah.
I mean, they did that in 1955. We just talked about it. I mean, right? That's what they did. It's crazy to think.
What? I don't know. I mean, I started diving into bits and pieces from the two of them years later talking about it. Because one of the things I've long loved is how people tell their own story, right? Because they're all different. We never really know how other people see us. But both of them kept coming back to it. Like Moss talked about how Jenks was such a hard ass and so clinical in how he looked at drivers and driving, that the fact that Jenks was sitting there calm and chill, he was like, well, I must be doing a pretty good job. And I loved the idea that essentially the second best driver on the planet, arguably the first best driver on the planet at the time, was just like, oh, somebody likes me. This is nice. And I thought about Ross and like how at some point you're talking to someone who's trying to do their best at something, and it doesn't matter whether they've done it or not before. It matters what they're doing in that moment and how you work with that, right?
Well, and I think, first of all, there were what I remember reading is there were points where I guess Jenkinson made a mistake or something and missed something or some reference or something like that. And Moss dealt with it. And Jenkinson's sort of takeaway from that was, wow, that guy is magic. Like Moss's skill is over the top. Moss basically turned to him and kind of like gave him a dirty look, like, don't ever do that again. and so, everything that I ever remember reading about, or even, you'd see I as a kid, Wide World of Sports, and there'd be something about Stirling Moss. And like, he always seemed like a nice guy. But I remember like there was a point when you're driving a car and, in that time it was your life depended on it. But also the result depended on it. Don't screw up. And so there was a hard part of Stirling Moss as well. So I think that's interesting. And reading certainly from Jenkinson's side of it is the part I think that amazed him the most was just how focused Stirling Moss could stay for 10 hours.
Yeah.
And certainly, well, we could get into a whole conversation about track limits today in Formula One.
Whoa.
And how, the consequences of going off track a little bit just don't seem to matter as much. And I actually think that in some ways it was almost easier for Stirling Moss to stay focused because his life depended on it.
You better.
Yeah.
Today, I just ran, I'm at Coda. I ran a little wide. Big deal.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, how he managed to do that, I think is on one hand, it's kind of surprising. On the other hand, it's like, well, yeah, when your life depends on it, you do it.
How do you get somebody to go back into that place when their life doesn't depend on it? How does that conversation work?
With a big stick.
I have a thought on that. I'm decidedly not a driver coach, but I've had a lot of drivers that I've worked with. My answer is you don't get somebody to get into that place.
Ooh.
They either are so competitive and so focused that it just automatically happens.
Yeah.
And the guys that don't finish second to the guys that do. I mean, it just happens. They're in that spot. They never have to think about it. Oh, I got to psych myself up to go do this. If you have to psych yourself up to do it, you can probably do it, but not at the level of the guys that it's just inbred in them to do it.
Yeah. Oh man. Sorry, go.
No, and I was going to I agree 100% with that. And I think that the other part of it is, I believe the best drivers in the world, including Stirling Moss back in his day, he lost focus.
Yeah.
The difference is that, race drivers are kind of stupidly optimistic. Things that go bad are just like, okay, move on. And if a human cannot do that, if a human gets hung up in I made a mistake. Oh my God, I made a mistake. Oh, that was a really bad mistake. And then they crash because of that, because they've lost their focus. They're not going to make it. And I think that's kind of related to what Jeff just talked about is the best ones. Yeah, just move on. What I was surprised going back and reading more about it, I can remember reading stories about this race years ago and, just kind of refreshing myself on this. Stirling Moss made mistakes.
Yeah.
He put it in a ditch and then drove it out of a ditch. He banged off hay bales at least twice, I think. Yeah. And yet it didn't bother him whatsoever because that was then. That happened back then. And I think that's part of what makes a great race driver a great race driver.
Yep. I think that's, NFL players always talk about, they get intercepted or they do a bad play. They always talk about next play. Play. Yeah. Focus on the next play. Well, it's the next corner if you're a race car driver or the next stint or whatever it is. I think that's a trait for most high level professionals, probably professionals, but for sure athletes, professional athletes.
God.
It probably, Sam, when we were doing the intro thing, I was almost going to go, I'm a Sam Smith wannabe as a writer. And
shut up.
Have you ever written something? Have you ever written something and then just go, oh, I'll deal with it later?
No, I usually write things and go, wow, I hate that. And then I put it on a shelf and I leave the room. It's crazy though. I never thought about that. I made a couple of notes and just little bits and pieces in the story that stuck out. And one of them is, so Jenk said those notes, right? The equivalent of right 5 over crest. And he's sitting there, he has a little box and he's wheeling them. It's like there's a, kind of looks like a pair of scrolls and he's wheeling them back and forth through a little window. And you can see as the paper moves, it rolls it forward and then there's the corner, there's the next corner. And you keep rolling it the whole race. And there were a couple of places where, because they scouted it in road cars, they didn't scout it in an SLR. They scouted it in like a 300 SL going or a Mercedes 220 sedan, which makes like 80 horse, something like that. And there were a couple of places where he was like, oh, this will be fine. And it was fine, but not quite. And one of them, I copied the entire passage and highlighted. I'm not going to make you listen to it, even though every voice in my head says read this word for word. But one of them, they come down a hill. There's a wump that like had been kind of a lumpy crossing in the going and like the 220 didn't care. And they're in 5th gear at 7,500 RPM, which is like $170 or something. And Jenkinson's line was, "We had made an error in our estimation of the severity of the hump," which sounds like the most like the driest stage directions for porn. But he goes, for a measurable amount of time, the vibro massage. Wow, I didn't realize that was going to go there. That you get sitting in a 300 SLR at that speed suddenly ceased, and there was time for us to look at each other with raised eyebrows before we landed again. Meaning they flew the car off a whump at 170, and it landed and bottomed and kept going on. And like he does some little mental math and says, basically at the speed we were traveling, it would have been, at least if it was a second we were in the air, would have been like 200 feet, and we were up there for more than a second. And you just sit there and you think about it, and you're like, and then they kept going. They didn't stop. They didn't think, well, what if X blew up or Y blew up, or they were just no. And it's not, well, Jenks made an error on the notes, or we screwed it up and we didn't. It's just keep going. And that's just so cool and so hard to wrap your head around at the same time.
That's over. We survived.
Yeah.
Here comes the next corner.
Right.
The other part of that around all those things, I always say that the driver with the most references usually wins.
Okay.
And I think that's part of, the preparation that they went through.
Yeah. And,
his little toilet roll of notes of 17 feet long or whatever it was. And basically they had more references than everybody else did. A lot of their competitors, it's cool. One of the things that I think is cool is, one of their main competitors they worried about the most was Piero Taruffi. And, I look at my bookshelf and I go, there's Piero Taruffi's, the techniques of motor racing. And, and then next to it is Dennis Jenkinson's book. And it's like, I started reading those when I was, 14 or something like that. But a lot of the Italians that they were competing against, they had those references, but in a different way.
Yeah.
They just had it from years of driving through those areas and through those little towns and everything. And the fact that they're showing up, they're rolling through these towns at 150 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I've driven through some of these towns in Italy today, and you couldn't do it.
No.
Like, even if they moved all the spectators and everything else, like, no. Yeah. So it's mind-boggling what they did. And, Stirling Moss is, recognized for being, this being one of his greatest drives ever.
He had some pretty good drives.
Yeah. Yeah. But Dennis Jenkinson, like, that guy's a god,
Yeah.
Well,
that's crazy.
It's on record now. Ross Bentley says journalists are gods. I'm going to write this down.
Right.
This is
There
good.
you go.
Yeah.
I feel very good about myself now.
If you come and ride with me and give me notes, we'll go do Tail of the Dragon or whatever together. And you come on up here and we'll ride around in my Lotus Elan. You give me notes on where to go.
No.
And you can be a god too.
No. All I know, I know adverbs and like prepositions, Ross. I don't know shit about anything else. So
not happening. Yeah. I was thinking, that race, I think people love the history and the drama and the fact that was so unique. And it got more that way as time went on, and they canceled the race and they couldn't do it anymore. And people looked back for those nostalgic kind of things. And it dawned on me that we kind of maybe have something similar to that in the Isle of Man TT. It's not so unlike that. It's a open road. There's no guardrails. There's no safer barriers. It's hauling ass on a motorcycle through the Isle of Man. And I'm super amazed and super impressed about the Isle of Man TT. Now that's what gives me a little bit of feel for what it must have been like to do 1,000 miles through Italy. That's another level, but the Isle of Man still kind of survives and gives us some sense of what that must have been like.
I heard years and years ago, one of the things my dad had a big collection of Duke Video VHS stuff when I was growing up, which was all like race car on boards, footage of WRC and old F1 races and things. And there was, at one point they reissued a Honda promo film called V4 Victory that was Joey Dunlop, who's one of the most successful riders of the island, riding for Honda on a V4. and they stuck a camera on his top triple, or maybe it was on his chest. I don't remember. But as he did a lap of the island, and before he went out, I mean, like, you watch the camera. It's one of the first on bike videos, and it's just mind blowing. Not least because, you know, they'll go in, the camera doesn't auto adjust, so they'll go into a dark spot, and it does what your eyes would do, where your pupils can't open quickly enough, and everything just goes dark because they're in a tunnel of trees at 160 miles an hour. But afterward, they interviewed him, and he was just the interviewer was like, "Well, you know, how do you memorize the course?" And Jeff, do you know offhand? Ross, I don't remember how long it is.
I think it's like 35 miles from end to end. I think
so let's say arguably 30 miles. How do you memorize 30 miles of course? And Dunlop is just, you know, this like lilting Irish accent. He's like, I don't. And the reporter's like, what? And he goes, oh, there's just bits I like and bits I don't like. And that sound like George Harrison there, which is not Ireland at all. But the fact that he didn't, there were moments where he was uncomfortable, and he's one of the fastest guys to ever go around the place. And the fact that, like, I don't know, I read somewhere Moss hated the Mille because all the stuff the techniques that he used in GP racing didn't work. They didn't work on tactically on 1,000 miles of unpredictable surface, right? It's hard to wrap your head around a lot of that stuff.
So I had the opportunity to spend some time around rally drivers and rally cross drivers and that for a few years there, and they're different. You know, they rely more. So on a circuit, it's all about those references, and it's the repetition, and how do you take that little reference, and you might, okay, I'm going to take the car, 4 feet past that, this lap. So there's that. Whereas rally, yes, there's the pre-run and stuff like that. So you have a basic idea of where it goes. And I think, Joey Dunlop had a basic idea where Isle of Man goes, right? He knew kind of where it went. So it wasn't like a complete surprise to him every lap or every time he ran it. And I'm going to say, there's the same kind of thing with Moss, was he kind of knew where he was going, but they rely more on the reaction and more on sort of a lot more on reading the road ahead. And I think I'm going to say it's a little bit of a technique or a skill that, well, first of all, I think race drivers today, I think they would improve if they spent a little bit more time on that kind of thing. And yet it's becoming a little bit of a lost art.
To me, that's the closest we get to that in circuit racing is on a drawing track.
Yeah.
Where it's changing lap to lap. The track is, the grip level is, and where the grip is changing lap to lap. And the rally drivers, I mean, they live in that. That's what they do, right? Yeah. And a lot of circuit drivers, one of mine and Ross's pet peeves is drivers who are trying to learn how to drive who won't go out because, it's raining. No, that's the time you should go out, and you should not go out when it's dry is really what you need. And so the rally drivers are great at that. And can you imagine how Stirling Moss must have been at that? I mean, gravel, you said however many cars have been going ahead of him for 10 hours before he went out. And at the Mille Miglia, and the track had to have changed from their pre-running. There must have been gravel on the track, or dew in the morning, or some Italian lady threw out her wash water on the sidewalk and it ran on the track. I mean, can you imagine? You could never know what the track was going to be like.
So, Sam, I'm curious because I know you're curious. If today, you got invited to sit down with Stirling Moss and Dennis Jenkinson, what would be your first question you'd ask them?
I honestly don't know, because, and that's a really terrible thing for a guy who professionally asks questions to say. So let's strike that from the record. I've got a lot of questions, Ross. I'm very, very curious.
So maybe let me rephrase that. It doesn't have to be your first. What would you ask them?
How Moss knew it was Jenks, right? Because on the one hand, like you put earlier, he not only was he entrusting his life to the guy, but he was taking that guy's life in his hands. And that's a massive amount of confidence, but also it doesn't matter how confident you are on some level. You have to think about the fact that if you ball it up, he's gone. And maybe it was a 1950s thing of, well, he agreed to be here. And, 10 years ago, everybody was dying in a war. Oh, no. So who cares? But I don't think it was. And Moss was a lot of things. He was equal parts arrogant and kind. He had been a superstar since his teens, like an internationally recognized name since his teens. And like, if Taylor Swift has taught us anything, it's that makes you mentally different. Not bad, not good, not worse, just different, right? That does things to you and changes you in ways that a normal upbringing doesn't. But mainly why he picked Jenks, and Jenks has written about this because he was Jenks, why he was okay with Moss. But I just would want to know if he ever had any second thoughts, or if he ever had any moments where, he's written so much about the guy being so at the top of his game and so good at the time. And he was genuinely a level above so many people. And remember,
maybe Jenks is the only guy that said yes.
Yeah, he'd asked 18 others.
Yeah. Why did you go to the prom with me? Well, next question. I had to wash my hands.
Right. I mean, that is, those rally guys, like Ross has said, I've never done any stage rally stuff, but we did do, I did get to do 2 years of rally cross racing, and a lot of our mechanics that we had came from stage rallying. So I got to kind of get a little insight into what that was like. And, that skill is amazing. And I'm talking the skill of like Ross said, the navigator guy too. I mean, to keep your focus. I mean, I would just be terrified with my eyes bulged out, looking straight ahead, like at the trees going whizzing by and the turn going that way. This guy has to just ignore all of that and still do the notes in a nice, calm way and all of that. Yeah, I'm with you, Sam. Maybe Jenks is the quote hero of that event, not Stirling Moss.
Yeah, I don't know, Ross. I mean, Jeff? What do you, when you look at all of this? Both of you, actually. I mean, what's the one thing that hits you about the story that sticks in your head? Because, like, for me, it's just the immense amount of risk we were comfortable with. And I don't mean in the car. I don't mean the driver in the car. I mean the fact that, like, when they came into Rome, there were so many spectators they couldn't see the road. And, he talks about them coming in at, like, when they were returning to Rome, because you passed through Rome twice, at 130 miles an hour, and they could not see the road, couldn't see the sidewalk, could barely see the next corner. So Moss starts swerving back and forth to make the crowd open up, and they do it. But the fact that everybody was just okay with standing there, or, I mean, even as late as Group B in the 80s, right? Like, that's what hits me, is our collected acceptance of risk. Like, what are you left with?
Well, I'm going to say the very first time when I, again, I read all this years and years ago, but as I'm refreshing my memory around this, and I just got my little notepad, and the very first word that I wrote down was spectators and 3 exclamation marks. For what I would love to, while I would love to have the opportunity to sit down with Moss and Jenkinson and have a conversation about all of that, what would be really cool is to meet somebody who was there, who stood on the side of the road as they were coming into Rome, and Moss is swerving a little bit to move them back. What were they thinking? Were they just thinking that nothing bad can ever happen? Because to me, it wouldn't take much to understand that something bad could happen.
Yeah. So
what makes a person go, I'm just going to stand here and I'm okay with it? Like, is it a lack of fear? Is it stupidity? Is it blindness? Is it naive? Like, what is it that makes somebody do that kind of stuff? And
I think I know.
Jeff's got the answer. Cool.
I have the answer.
It's probably a formula and he's got it on a spreadsheet.
No spreadsheets not allowed. I think it's because I'll ask another question that may answer the thing. What made Jim Clark and Dan Gurney and Jochen Rindt and those guys drive race cars with roll bars that came up to their neck with no seat belts, 80 gallons of fuel around them, a helmet with open face with some goggles and a scarf? why did they do that? Didn't they know the risk? To me, it's that, no, they didn't know the risk at the time until somebody got hurt really bad because the roll bar was too low, or somebody got hurt because they didn't have a Hans device, or somebody got hurt because there wasn't a safer barrier there. I would say that's
because they didn't know any better.
They didn't.
Right?
I don't think the spectators didn't know it was dangerous until 20 of them got wiped out, and then they went, "Oh, geez, I shouldn't stand that close."
So what I find amazing about that is that, at that point, I mean, I read some statistics somewhere years and years ago. It said something like, the mortality rate for Grand Prix drivers between 1950 something and, basically the end of the cigar body era when the wings came in the late 60s and early 70s was something like 40% in some seasons, meaning there were seasons where 40% of the grid was just snap, wiped out, gone, Thanos out of existence. And they, Jackie Stewart talks about this. Everybody in period had a way of coping. And like Phil Hill's answer was to go to pieces very quietly and become a ball of nerves. And some others were to not think about it. And I don't, the crazy thing about humanity is that I can empathize with every single one of those people while also not understanding how any one of those people dealt with it in that fashion, right? Like I can say, yeah, I could do that in period. But then when you get some distance on it, you think, what? Like, just wait, how? Mm-hmm. Do you, I mean, it's really common. Like Donnie used to write about, how the only way he was comfortable in, say, like a turbo Can-Am car makes 1,000 horsepower in his wing. And like, the rear bodywork on a 917 came off at Mid-Ohio and the car flipped and then he was out of the season for a year. Like the only way he was comfortable with that was knowing that he had his hands on every part of the car. Like, how do you guys have met so many people that do things like this for a living. What's the most common way of dealing with the risk or looking at it?
So I'm going to say that most of the best drivers I know are a little bit fanatical about the prep of, their equipment and that kind of stuff. I'm going to say, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but many of the drivers, they don't walk up and stand there and go, what are you doing to the rear dampers on the car? Or that, like, because that's there, there's a certain level of just trust there that happens.
For sure.
And I mean, I can walk into a team and watch the crew working on the car and I can get a level of trust.
Yep.
Or not by just watching. Like you can kind of go, they work with tools well, like they got good hands. Like you can just see some of that. So I think, the best drivers, they've recognized that. I often say the best race drivers are really good at pattern matching. You see something and you go, I've seen this pattern before and that's why I'm not going to make this pass or I'm going to attempt this pass right now. Mm-hmm. But the same thing happens, outside of the car. You just see patterns and you go, I've seen somebody use tools that way and I trust them. So there's a level of that. But, I've seen the way Colin looks after his driving equipment. And, it's a small little piece of it, but, I'm the way Jenkinson and Moss prepared all their equipment and everything. And, I will say, one of the things that I think made that thing a success was the way Mercedes prepared.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like, it was mind boggling to think that they did things that to this day, the best teams in the world do. Like, well, I guess they've copied that, but they need a new part. They would make a new part and they'd fly it in.
Yeah.
And you're like, I didn't think people did that back then, but they did. So I think, a big part of it, and maybe the question of how do they deal with all of that, a big part of it is the preparation.
Yeah.
And it's all those little details. And that's why somebody goes, yeah, I'm willing to take that risk because I did everything I possibly could, or we did everything we possibly could.
It's interesting you made the pattern matching point just because you said earlier that, so many pattern, like driving on a drying track is not pattern matching, right? That's something more dynamic and complex. And you said that skill the skill of being able to read and react and build and improvise is going away. Why? Is it just because everything's become, not that racing's ever predictable, but is it that everything's become more predictable in the sport in general, or is there something else?
I mean, I think if you're asking the question, I do think the sport has become more predictable.
Okay.
So I think that's the case, but there's a part of, I actually think that the best drivers, what they really like is when it's less predictable to some extent, not to the point of, if I go off this track, I'm going to burst into flames and die. I mean, not to that level, but the best drivers love those changing conditions. The best drivers adapt better because they're willing to adapt to that. Jeff, you said the number of times we hear drivers say, well, it's raining, I'm not going to go out and do that. That's the, I often say drivers get comfortable being uncomfortable.
And the best ones are the best at that.
Yeah.
I think I agree with you 100%, Ross. It's the unpredictability. I think it's what spectators for sure like, right? The Mille Miglia was pretty unpredictable. But the drivers like it too. Drivers, a good example are tire warmers. Tire warmers just make the outlap easier and everybody's the same now. Yeah. What I love is watching drivers on cold tires, 20 of them. They are not the same. Some of them are really, really good on that outlap. Some of them are terrible. And you get to see that. And the drivers get to have that unpredictability. The rain, drying conditions, those unpredictable things. I think we've refined racing to a point now where those are very, very small. The Mille Miglia wasn't won because Stirling Moss could save 1% more fuel and his last pit stop was 2 seconds faster than the guy who couldn't save it. That's the way most of the IMSA races are won now, by who can save the most amount of fuel in the stint over the length of the race, so that last pit stop is 3 seconds shorter to fill his car than his competitor, and he comes out ahead of him. And that's what decides the race. Yeah. It's been so refined that the unpredictability has gone down. And I think that Mille Miglia was the most unpredictable race we've seen, and it got more and more predictable, which is less and less fun, I think.
Yeah. What? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ross.
I think of everything that I've ever done, whether it's driving or coaching even. I like it when I don't know what's going to happen. Like it's, yeah. Does it, I don't know, there's all sorts of does the adrenaline flow more? Does there, there's a little bit of, a slight amount of fear factor. I think of people, extreme athletes who, they're living on that edge all the time. Alex Honnold, free solo. I mean, man, but guess if you watch that movie, the preparation that he put in to predict his moves, he's trying to he's trying to get as many of the things down to that predictable level. But there were certain things where you just go for it. Yep. But I think if you hadn't done all that preparation, you wouldn't do it. You would never do that.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. Does it? I mean, like as a, all the club racing I've done has been very, very hang out, have a bunch of beer, and then a car appears, right? And so much of that has been the point.
In that order?
No. Let's go with no. But all of that, like part of the joy of it is it is the unpredictability. And that's, I mean, would I love to be a part of, a Manhattan project of a race team where everything is perfect? Yeah, but that's not how club racing works on so many levels, unless you're, a certain type of very lucky person. But that's been so much of my experience with it. And I've never thought about this before, but so much, it's always been, because everybody has bad days when they're doing something they love. You're like, well, gee, great. And grumble. This isn't the perfect thing that I wanted. And then later you feel stupid about it, but you feel stupid about not looking around and being like, I'm very lucky to be doing this and I should shut up. But those days, the thing that I would change is always the thing that wasn't predictable, right? The thing that I couldn't nail down or be better at, or I didn't react to an unpredictable situation the way I wanted to. Like as an engineer, does that, like Jeff, does that just drive you nuts? Like does all the unpredictable things, does it stack and frustrate or what?
I mean, that's really my job is to make sure during a 24-hour race or whatever race that there are no unpredictable things. Because if there is, I didn't prepare right. I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that possibility. I didn't, I want everything to happen in the race. And when something happens, I want to go, oh, yep, I thought about this and here's what we do. Oh, yep, I know what to do here. Oh, this happened. That guy did this on his strategy. He put this driver in at this time. I know exactly what to do. I need to put this driver in now and stay out for an extra 3 laps and save fuel during this stint. I don't want any unpredictable things. And I just got done saying that I like unpredictable things. To win races, I hate unpredictable things. But to watch races or to enjoy races, I like unpredictable things. And as an engineer, it's what I've always said when Colin was little. The worst thing, I want the drivers to compete for the win, and I want the drivers to win or lose the races. As an engineer, my worst fear when Colin was racing go-karts is that I didn't get him the best engine or the best tires or equal to everybody. I would hate for him to lose a race because his equipment wasn't as good as the next guy. I didn't mind if he lost a race because he made a mistake driving or didn't do something correctly. That didn't bother me. So me, as a race engineer, I want to make it unpredictable from my end and let the drivers decide it in super unpredictable conditions, restarts, drying conditions, cold tires, whatever.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about with the Mille Miglia, that is Moss and Jenkinson weren't in the only Mercedes-Benz.
No, that's the interesting part.
I was about to say his name. That Argentinian guy was also driving one of the same cars, as well as a couple other factory Mercedes drivers.
And did they have co-drivers too?
Everybody but the Argentinian guy, I believe. Definitely not the Argentinian guy. I think I know where you're going, Ross. Take it. I'm sorry.
It's just. So at the end of the day, which team dealt with the unpredictability the best? Which one prepared the best? Which one thought through all that kind of stuff? And the one thing that sort of kept coming through in everything that you ever read or hear about that race is how calm Moss and Jenkinson stayed throughout that race.
Yeah.
Like, you're talking about them going over this hump at 170 miles an hour and getting airborne for more than a second. And the two of them kind of raise their eyebrows at each other like, seriously? I would like to know if that actually happened. But I think, just whether it happened literally or, that's kind of where they were both at.
Right.
They're like, I wonder how this is going to end. They stayed calm throughout that entire thing. And I guess, again, what separates the best from the rest is often that, how do you deal with those problems?
Yeah.
And, Jeff, I know you like to predict things, and I know that's what engineering is all about, right? But I've seen the way you've reacted to things that couldn't be predicted, or, somebody did something that was a complete surprise. And it's how you respond to those things. And even that went wrong, or that, we crashed a car. Now what do we do? Okay, let's move on. What's the next thing? What's the next corner? What's the, how do you deal with that?
And that's to your point, Ross, and we should probably wrap things up. We're about out of time on this, but to your point, there were other Mercedes-Benzes, there were other 300 SLRs, right? And the Argentinian guy, and I guess we can say his name now. His name was Juan Manuel Fangio. He was middle-aged, much like me, and had, extremely, extremely good at many things, much like me. Probably I'm better with adverbs. Who knows? Let's just throw it out there. But he was in a car, and he elected not. This is a guy who at the time Moss held up as the best driver in the world. And later, he would always say, decades on, long after Fangio died, he would say that Fangio was constantly putting on clinics for him, and just the dude that he looked to who had all the answers, even as his career was eclipsing his. And Fangio was in another Mercedes, and same car, he did not want a navigator. He ran without a navigator. And he was the only other Mercedes out of I think it was a 4-car team to finish. And he finished on 7 cylinders because one of the injection pipes, one of the feed lines, one of the injectors had broken. And with 7 cylinders and no navigator, he was only half an hour behind Moss after 1,000 miles. And part of you is like, oh, cool. But also like, oh, wait, does that diminish the other achievement? Or how does that pull it apart? And what does it say about this and that and the other? And it's just this wonderful little note that like, none of these things are as simple as we ever think, right? This is one of the most heroic moments in motorsport. And even then, like it's not quite a Pete Rose asterisk, but there's an asterisk where like, oh yeah, but wait, and this. And that's what I love about this stuff. And that's what I love about, any of these stories is that they're all deeply human moments, and human moments are not simple,
And that's what we're going to try to do every week, right? Talk about those stories and that exact thing.
Somebody's got to say it. Who's going to say it? I already said it once. I can't say it again. Who's going to say it?
Right.
Oh, right. It's not the...
it's not the car.
Thank you. There.
I was like, throughout this whole thing, the Mercedes was an amazing car.
Yeah.
But there were drivers in Ferraris that were faster.
Yeah.
Right.
So...
And that's what I love about racing, right? I said that about my job is to try to get all those predictable things so that the drivers can decide it on the racetrack. And my guy has the best thing, because I believe as a race engineer, and people think I'm crazy, but it is not the car. It's about humans racing against each other. That's what I love about it.
Well, on that note, thanks for listening. Thanks for getting this far, and we'll see you next time.